Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to this Sunday morning session that is very important and timely on transgender and fascist context. And I'm very excited to be introducing Florence Ashley, who will be talking to us about the rise in anti-trans and related movements. Florence is an assistant professor at the U of A's Faculty of Law and a member of the Dossetor Health Ethics Centre. They served as the first openly trans feminine clerk at the Supreme Court of Canada in 2019-2020. And among their many publications are two books that I want to mention. One, the first Banning Transgender Conversion Practices, a Legal and Policy Analysis, which I highly recommend. And the second, more recent collection of personal essays, which I haven't had the joy of reading yet, but I'm very excited for. Titled Gender Fucking, the Pleasures and Politics of Living in a Gendered Body. And to give you a sense of their wide impact, their work has been cited by the Supreme Court of Canada, the United Nations Independent Expert on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity, and the World Professional Association of Transgender Health Standards of Care, among many other position statements, reviews, guidelines in numerous countries. But I want to make sure we have a lot of time for discussion, so I'm going to keep my intro brief and pass it to you, Florence.
Good morning, everybody. And yeah, I don't know why people keep listening to me. It's very weird. First of all, I hate just how timely my work is right now. That really is annoying. I liked it better when it wasn't. Partly because I feel like in an odd way, my work being timely has meant that it matters less because the people in power no longer care. Because they're just doing whatever they think the Take Back Alberta crowd wants. That said, when we're talking about democracy and fascism, one thing that is very noticeable is like one of the very first assaults in the current resurgence of fascism has been against trans communities and what they call quote-unquote gender ideology, favorite term of the Catholic Church, which is being seen in Canada with the kind of the creep of anti-trans politics northward. And this week is especially timely because the notwithstanding clause was just used by the Alberta government in order to shield from constitutional scrutiny 3 laws that target trans youth, one that prevents trans girls and trans women in general from playing sports on women's teams, one that bans gender-affirming care for minors until they're like 16, and another that targets the education sphere by essentially forcing trans youth to out themselves to their parents and also giving the parents a veto on their choice of name and pronouns in schools, again until they're 16, although the outing continues after that, if I recall. Although sometimes I mix up the different provinces because they all have like slightly different tweaks in their like awful laws. It's been interesting seeing the notwithstanding clause being used because, you know, the government is like, oh, we're doing this for the benefit of the children. Save the children, save the whales. Like, what's kind of ironic is this idea of, oh, we're saving the children by suspending their right to life, liberty, and security of the person. And it's pretty kind of hard to understand how you're supposed to be protecting somebody by suspending their right to live. But that's not the only irony. The other irony is like they're talking about how they're just following the science. I'm just kind of wondering why they think they know better than, say, the Alberta Medical Association and the Canadian Medical Association, both of which have been very opposed to the healthcare ban, especially in the context where the UCP government has more MLAs who have compared trans children to literal excrements than MLAs that have medical training. And so I'm just kind of wondering where exactly they're getting their so-called expertise and evidence from. Of course, it's the UCP government. They wouldn't know evidence if it slapped them in the face. But they also don't care. My talk, I essentially want to try to explore and understand better why it is that they're targeting trans youth, and why now? It's tempting to think that, well, it's just bigotry, and bigotry is going to do what it does, and it's just going to, target various groups as kind of undesirable. But that's not a super satisfying explanation, because we can't work with that, first of all. But the second thing is, it doesn't really explain what it needs to explain. And what it needs to explain is why we see historical variations, first of all, but also why this group? Why not any other group? Why not be persecuting redheads, Why is it that they're targeting trans kids? I want to suggest that's not an accident, right? There's a reason why trans kids specifically are being targeted. My suggestion is that we can best understand it if we see it as essentially boiling down to white supremacy and, racial capitalism, but I'm going to let you do the last connect between white supremacy and racial capitalism. Unless we have time, we'll see. I might talk about it a bit. In fact, we can draw a direct line between anti-trans laws, anti-abortion movements, and anti-immigrant and racist laws. There's a reason why these things appear in a trio. There's a reason why anti-trans, anti-abortion, and anti-immigrant movements are always the same movement and come up at the same time. And this is not just now, this is a historical fact, right? If you look at Nazi Germany, right, it was, I don't actually know a ton about Nazi approaches to abortion, but they're eugenicists, so they probably really liked it for some people and not others. But one thing we noticed is the way in which the anti-Semitic sentiments of the Nazis was just so deeply wedded to their attack on queer and trans people. In fact, there's this probably apocryphal quote of how apparently Hitler would have called Magnus Hirschfeld the most dangerous Jew in the world. And while it's probably not true, I was not able to actually track the source for the statement, it speaks to a very real ethos within Nazi Germany, where one of the first people who were targeted were queer and trans communities. And in fact, if you Google Nazi book burning, a lot of the pictures and all of the most well-known pictures are actually from the burning of Hirschfeld's Institute archives, which is where they were doing work for queer and trans people. Hirschfeld being Jewish, it was part of their whole theory of Jews are corrupting Aryan society by turning kids trans. They weren't saying kids back then, but frankly, the thing is, I've heard that very same thing, I've read that very same thing on posters with my friend's face on them, friends who happen to be trans and Jewish. This is a recurring pattern. So why do they come together? That's my goal here today, is to map these links between anti-trans movements, anti-abortion movements, and white supremacy, and show the intertwined nature of anti-fascist struggles and the need to organize in solidarity across difference so that we can actually attack all these things at once. Because if we just pick out some of them, of course people can focus their own efforts on what they're best equipped to address. But if we start kind of separating out and dividing our movements, then it's not actually going to work, right? Because you're not going to be attacking the supportive structure where all of these things go together. So if you try to remove just one of them, it's going to kind of be pulled back in by the other parts of the structure. Now, my starting point here is this quote by Julian Young of Idaho, who is a Republican, a state representative, if I recall, who, I want to say about 2 years ago, was asked about, why they're attacking access to gender-affirming care for trans youth, and responded, very tellingly, I see this conversation as an extension of the pro-life argument. We're not talking about the life of the child, but we're talking about the potential to give life to another generation. For those who are familiar with that, it might remind you a little bit of an infamous slogan that has 14 words in it, very popularized by David Duke, the Grand Wizard of the KKK. They have such fucking clown-ass, like, title names. Like, also, that's an insult to clowns. I don't, like... But the slogan goes, we must secure the existence of our people in a future for white children, right? And here we're talking about the potential of giving life to another generation. The only thing that's missing is the word white. For anybody who's ever seen Republican politicians, you know it was implied. Her statement ties into this demographic anxiety, this fear that white people are no longer going to be the majority, and thus are going to lose this socio-political power and even this economic power. And we see this anxiety embodied in theories like Great Replacement theory and white genocide theory, right? The idea that there's a sort of cultural genocide against white people, and the Great Replacement theory, which is just like a very like old school Nazi theory, essentially, that the Jews are trying to replace white people. As a Jewish trans person, just feels so great. You know, this idea like there's declining birth rates among white people, and then there's immigration, and there's also change in voter demographic, especially with more and more movements to try to give more ability to vote to communities that aren't just white people. It should be, you know, no surprise that as part of like where there was this anti-immigrant sentiment I talked about, this anti-trans, anti-abortion, but in the US, especially now, we're really seeing a push towards essentially making it as difficult as possible, if not impossible, for Black people to vote, and for also immigrant communities to vote. And anybody who's not going to vote for the Republicans, which, I mean, it's mostly like everybody except white people. We've also seen this demographic anxiety really get a lot of spotlight with, you know, the fascist's friend-in-chief, the Elon Musk of the world. And by Elon Musk of the world, I mean Elon Musk himself specifically, but also like all of the people that are kind of very Elon Musk-y in flavor, like Peter Thiel, etc. All of that group who are like really, really talking a lot about, you know, the people not having enough kids. Like last time I talked about this, there was like a spike of article about Malcolm and Simone Collins and the pronatalist movement. And it was kind of interesting how they would try to circumvent the racial question in the movement by being like, no, we're totally not racist. We have 2 Black people in our movement. But it kind of boils down to a thing that Lindsey Graham said, which is Republicans are not generating enough angry white guys to stay in business in the long term. He was saying it a little bit lightheartedly, but like he's kind of selling the punch here, right? Like, it's very true, like that's what their fear is. It's a fear for the Republican Party, but it's specifically a fear for the kinds of white people that the Republican Party is there to represent. And by the way, that's not like working class white people, like they pretend to care, but it's really kind of well-off, privileged white people that they're really trying to benefit. And the working class white people in rural areas are just pawns in their game. In response to that demographic anxiety, which is fundamentally racist, right? They're afraid that they're gonna lose power as white people, and they want to keep power because they want to subjugate other groups. But also, they're afraid that they're gonna get treated like they treat other groups. That's also part of the equation. In fact, I think a lot of them just cannot fathom being treated well by, you know, non-white people, because they're like, well, isn't that what just what people do? Because, I mean, a lot of the Republican philosophy is very like, you know, eat or get eaten, right? And so they justify their own hatred by telling themselves, well, if others were in the same position, they would do the same, right? This is just the law of the jungle, and this is how we do things. And so how do they respond to that? Well, we see a rise in narratives around what they call traditional family values. This idea that womanhood is essentially the same as motherhood, right? That the goal of womanhood is motherhood as both a nature, but also a divine purpose. One of the best quotes for that is this 1873 case, I think it was a US Supreme Court, Bradwell versus Illinois, and it said, the paramount destiny and mission of woman are to fulfill the noble and benign offices of wife and mother. Okay, weirdo. This is not, of course, a racially neutral ideal, right? Traditional family values are fundamentally white, and the reproductive desire that underpins it is really meant to be for white people and white children specifically. We saw this notably in how racialized, the racialization of debates around abortion just kind of slips out sometimes. Seriously, the far right is their own worst enemy. They cannot keep their mouth shut. It's fantastic for somebody who does this work, but it's also really disheartening because they say it and nobody gives a shit. Let's face it, right? When trans kids were called excrements, no, that person's back on the, conservative caucus. Nothing really happened there. But when Roe v. Wade was overturned, another Republican representative, Mary Miller, said it was a historic victory for white life. She claimed that she misspoke and issued a correction. It was just it slid the tongue. I think it was intentional, but if not, what a Freudian slip. This is not a surprise to anybody who knows about the history of abortion, because the reality is that reproductive control was always racial, right? Eugenics, what's another name for eugenics? Racial hygiene. In the US, there's a long history of sterilization of Black, Indigenous, and Puerto Rican women, and we see that a lot in Canada too, very long history of sterilization, especially of Indigenous women, one that is still occurring to various degrees today. There's also things in the cultural mindset, insults like cuck, being used to shame interracial friendships and relationships, right? It's really meant to drive this sort of shame among white people of white women potentially dating, usually a Black man, being imagined as part of that insult. This cultural phenomenon where they're trying to control the sexuality and also just the norm, the other non-romantic, non-sexual relationships of white women in order to ensure that they get white babies. That's what it's kind of all about. And so it might be more accurate to say that in that vision, the nature of womanhood is not reproduction, but white reproduction specifically. And we see that aspect play out in the long history of enslaved Black women serving as wet nurses for white children. And the care labor today being performed by immigrant women. In many ways, a lot of the kind of very high profile, high flying female attorneys that are constantly being asked, how do you balance, work and life balance, is by having care labor outsourced to immigrant women who oftentimes have a lot less time to be with their child as a result. And when they're attacking abortion, what they're really trying to do is to reinforce the message of woman equals baby factory. And this is about the message, not about the enforcement, right? They're not concerned that banning abortion might increase birth rates among Black, Latina, and Indigenous communities. Why not? Well, they've set up the rest of the structure so that it doesn't really matter, in the sense that there's going to be selective enforcement of these laws, where the people who are the most targeted by anti-abortion laws are going to be Black, Latina, Indigenous women. And a lot of the time they're not really going to enforce it against, the white women who are dating Republican representatives. And with that, they know also that with this selective enforcement, you're going to get a criminalization of birthing parents. And they know, first of all, that in the US, felony disenfranchisement is a thing, which means if you're a felon, you cannot vote. And they know that if you criminalize the birthing parent and they have a child, then, that child is probably going to end up in the foster care to prison pipeline, in which case they'll get criminalized and they'll also get disenfranchised. So they've set it up to ensure as much as possible that to the extent that they can, they're going to misuse and abuse these laws in order to prevent the voting power of non-white communities. And so it's a bit of a kind of a two birds, one stone kind of situation for them, because really what they're interested in is in the message, sending the message specifically to white women, but they're going to use all the tools that they have to ensure that as much as possible, anybody who's not white that's going to receive the same message is going to be punished one way or another, so that they don't challenge the demographic power of white people. So what about trans people? How does that fit with trans people? Well, once we've been to gender, it's not really hard to make the last step to trans people, but let's spell it out. The obvious thing is that trans people challenge gendered ideologies. It's a challenge to the idea of a gender that is really one's nature, destiny, and essence as a reproductive thing, right? This reproductive imperative that says, gender is about whether you're going to be a dad or a mom. And a dad or a mom is dictated by whether the baby pops out of you or whether the baby is created by your sperm, right? And so from the kind of Republican conservative mindset and the UCP mindset, if gender is just a feeling, and that's how they kind of see trans philosophy, which, it's more complicated than that, but whatever. But if gender is just a feeling, as they put it, how can we say that women's purpose is to bear and raise children, right? And if people can mess with their reproductive organs, then how can reproduction be the pinnacle of existence? This challenges the symbolism. This challenges the ideology behind the drive to have more white children. This is not about the actual reproductive futures, right? They don't give a shit about the kids that trans youth, once they grow up, may or may not have. They do not care. Otherwise, they would try to do things like increasing access to assisted reproduction, to fertility counseling, to all sorts of support so that people can actually have kids. Because the reality is, the reason people don't want to have kids is because it's so fucking expensive and society is not set up to actually help, right? We live in a world that's actually very hostile against the very concept of having children, and ironically also hostile against not having children. They somehow make it suck whatever you do. That's one of the great, it's the fantastic, it's just the genius idea of capitalism is make life terrible for everybody no matter what you do, unless you're super rich, except that if you're super rich you just feel dead inside anyway, so it still sucks for you. And I'm not gonna say that it's worse being a rich person and being poor. Obviously, it's rather have the money. But it still sucks for everybody. There's just it's just degrees of bad. In fact, despite their claim about the reproductive capabilities of trans youth and whether they'll be able to have children, make those choices, they actually don't want trans people reproducing at all, right? They target trans people in family law. They try to take their kids away. They target them to make it impossible for them to adopt or to foster children. They try to make it really hard for trans people to be parents as much as they can. Here again, they really like to kind of sell the punch with stuff that they say, and again, it never actually ends up mattering anyway, so they might as well tell us the entire plan. And here we have Michael Knowles, who said this, again, about 2 years ago at the CPAC conference, the big conservative party. Is it called CPAC, something like that? Yeah. And he said, for the good of society, transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely. And of course, we've got our homegrown variant of Alberta MLA, Jennifer Johnson, comparing trans youth in schools to adding a teaspoon of feces to a batch of cookies. And I wouldn't be surprised if, in our head, the cookies are like, white cookies. They're macadamia nut. They're not, I mean, let's just be honest, right? Like, the chances are. The chances that she's actually imagining a multicultural and culturally diverse batch of cookies is very low. Not zero, but, I wouldn't bet my life on it. And this sells again the punch. Like, it's about the good of society, not the good of trans people. However much they may be saying that they're trying to protect trans kids, that's not what they're doing, right? They're trying to protect the quote-unquote good of society, and by that they mean the society that they imagine and want, which is, well, a very kind of white, cisgender, heterosexual, ableist, like, this very, like, you're looking like a 1930s American movie that was, funded by, like, the KKK. We see there, this idea of like, we must target trans people for the good of society. We've kind of circled back to what I started with, right? Which is this anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that trans people are this Jewish ploy to destroy the West, right? That Nazis were really big fans of. Well, this is what we're back at. And I'm not saying that everybody who's attacking trans people necessarily personally believes in that, but they're intertwined with people who do, right? And even if they're like not really believing that, it's the sort of stuff of like, well, we can't say that, and I'm not saying I believe this, but, this is the kind of like thing where they're like, I might not believe it, but they're like about this close to believing it, or saying, or admitting that they believe it. And yet, ironically, they do get to claim that they're doing this for the good of trans youth because there's a loss of social status that's associated with being trans. In fact, there's this like really great paper from law that talks about whiteness as property. This is talking about like property law, right? So like whiteness is something you own a little bit like you own a degree. In a sense, whiteness in Western society is treated a little bit like having a college degree. Right, in that sense, like something you kind of own and that confers certain benefits that's not available to other people. It's also a conditional one in that you don't fully get access to it if you're trans. Like if you're trans, your degree from Harvard gets downgraded from degree at like University of Phoenix, which is a pay-for degree for-profit school in the US. Like there's this kind of conditionality to it, and that's where the loss of status quo, in fact, is perceived as a challenge to whiteness, because in a certain way, there's a partial loss of whiteness by being trans. So by that, I'm not saying that that being trans makes you not white. In fact, I'm not saying that trans people are white, because a lot of trans people aren't. But let's remember, in their imaginary of like the Republican, first of all, they largely have white trans kids in mind. Like that's what they're thinking of, first of all. But they're also very comfortable with the idea that like, well, we can deny the kind of the diploma of whiteness or some of the benefits of the diploma of whiteness without saying that they're necessarily like not white. But there's still this loss that is tied to racial status. And why is that? Well, because the ideals of gender are fundamentally racialized. The ideal of masculinity and femininity in Canadian, American, and Western European society is based on concepts of white manhood and white womanhood. And that's the standard that is being set up. And so they get to claim that they're acting for the good of trans youth, not because there's a real kind of loss or harm to trans youth, but because there is a harm to their social status. It's worse being trans than not being trans in the hierarchy of values of, well, the UCP and other Pierre Poilievre's party and folks like that. Then why are they targeting schools, sports, and gender-affirming healthcare? Well, we can circle back to that. We've got the pieces of the puzzle that allow us to answer. The obvious one is they're targeting gender-affirming healthcare because of the reproductive message. The accessibility of gender-affirming healthcare challenges this idea of gender reproductive destiny, of the goal of life is, depending on which genitals you're born with, to become a father or a mother, and like that's all that life is about. Well, like, the existence of trans people challenges that, and so they attack that. In many ways, it should alarm us because they can, in fact, use the same scientific and legal arguments to target abortion, and they are trying to do so, right? In the US, we've seen it very prominently, but we're seeing it in Canada. Like, I mean, it's pretty telling that people are trying to bring back debates around abortion, like around the same days that they used the notwithstanding clause to attack gender-affirming care in the province. I think a lot of people don't realize just how precarious the legal standing of abortion is in Canada, because we're all kind of like used to like certain precedents and this idea of certain precedents protecting us most often. Usually people have in mind like Morgenthaler. And while they are meaningful precedents, and I have no doubt that at least with the current Supreme Court, they'd find a way to continue protecting abortion, the precedent is actually a lot narrower than people realize, and actually it doesn't really offer that great a protection of abortion, because it's pretty heavily based on the fact that at the time, abortion was not actually like illegal, it was just that the standards were so difficult that effectively nobody could get it. But it's like partly turned, like a lot of the legal argument, the technical legal argument turns on that, and so it's not clear that it would transpose to a situation where, it just straight up made illegal without any sort of process or whatever. This is something we need to keep in mind, right? The relationship between the two is also because like they're kind of similar, right? Scientifically speaking, like when it comes to the debates around like mental health and stuff like that, there's a lot of similarities between access to gender-affirming care and access to abortion, one of which being none of them are actually like cures or treatment for illnesses. Being pregnant is not an illness, and neither is not wanting to be. It's just that you have, say, a life plan that doesn't include having a kid right now, or having a kid with this co-parent because they suck. Whatever it is, there's not really anything diagnostic in terms of like it would be weird to have a DSM diagnosis of wanting to have an abortion, even though they kind of do that in England. Fucking weird place. And that's the same thing in gender-affirming healthcare, right? Like, yes, of course, not having access to the treatment that allows you to align your body with your sort of sense of gender embodiment can and often does cause a lot of distress and problems in social functioning, etc. But you're not accessing it to make yourself happy. You're accessing it because that's my gender and this fits with my idea of my gender. The mental health part is, it's a very nice secondary, right? But it's secondary. It's a byproduct of me kind of getting to be myself and deciding what kind of person I get to be in the world. There's a lot of similarities, and that does mean that policies, scientific and legal arguments that target one will also tend to target the other. And so we need to be kind of mindful of that. Then what about schools? Well, schools are a central site of indoctrination and is also really a site of embodying the fascism of the far-right nuclear model of the family, right? Their idea of the family is very fascist. Right, you have this parental rights framework where it's like children are not full-fledged human beings in this model of the family. They're rather an externalization of the self in order to guarantee some form of immortality. They're essentially property. They're essentially like a clone that you've pre-built and gets to be your property until the state no longer lets you treat them as property, and then by then you're kind of supposed to hope that they just like become your extension of life immortal. They're not seen as full-fledged being that must be supported into blossoming into their best, full selves of themselves. Rather, they're encouraged into becoming whatever you couldn't go to school for. Which, like, look, go to fucking therapy instead of getting a kid, or alongside getting a kid. But of course, society makes it very difficult to go to therapy because it wants us traumatized. What's interesting is like the centrality of schools as a site of indoctrination is made evident by the contagion narrative, right? This idea of like, oh, trans people are turning other kids trans, and if you're exposed to a trans kid, you're going to become trans, and everybody's going to be trans. And it just kind of shows the fundamental weakness and vulnerability of gender from this bioessentialist, reproductive, far-right mindset. You're like, if it's natural, why is it so damn vulnerable that you need to do everything to protect it? If it was really natural, you would expect that you didn't really have to do anything to protect it. It would just happen. But it's not. And that's why they're focused on schools so much, because you don't want trans existence putting into their kids' head the fact that, like, yeah, whatever, they might not be trans, but maybe they don't want kids in the future, right? Maybe they don't want to heed the call of gender and do the thing where they, you know, they become, well, a trad wife is what they usually want, right? And then what about sports? Well, the main thing is like sports are fundamentally a like white masculine fantasy in our society. I don't mean like the individuals that play sports or whatever, but I mean like the social function of sports, and sports in the social imaginary really this kind of white masculine fantasy. And it's meant to show the inherent superiority of men over women on a biological level, right? And there's this idea of like, ooh, male sports is serious competition and female sports is ooh, fun. Right, like there's this sort of like, male sports is really the real thing, which is why we don't pay anybody in the WNBA much money, or in the US female soccer team, even though they are so much better than the men. When you allow trans youth, not only does it challenge this bioessentialism of like the strength, which is part of this sort of imagined division of labor between men and women. The men are strong, so they work, and they provide. And women are caregivers because they're weak, I guess, or I don't know. Look, I can't say I fully always track the logic, but also it challenges the idea of inherent superiority, especially if they lose, because like, if trans people lose despite the fact they're supposed to be like innately better, that means that maybe men aren't inherently better at sport, period, right, in their mind. Like, don't tell them about hormones, they get confused. But what's important to note here, by the way, is like, it's not about whether trans people are playing the right team. There's no right team for trans people to play. It's about excluding trans people from sports. They don't want trans people in sports at all, just like they don't want trans people in bathrooms. They don't care about the right team or the right bathroom. That's not what they're after. It's about not having trans people there. You know, because trans people, yuck. Like, that's the logic. Of course, then they go on, you know, Pornhub and jerk it off trans people, but look, that's a different talk. And this scheme is, again, highly racialized because of the relationships between like gender and race. There's a reason why black women are being disproportionately targeted by these sex verification schemes. First is because initially they would just insist on white athletic superiority. They were like, white people are better at sports, which like in today's world is actually kind of interesting because we've kind of flipped that, right? The idea tends to be nowadays that especially black people are better at sports and white people are worse at sports, but like that didn't used to be the case. Like that's something that has changed over history, which shows just how much of it is made up. But they've moved away from that for the obvious reason that like if you say that, then like everybody knows you're a racist, and we're not quite back at that being socially acceptable to say yet. Give it a couple of years. And so instead what they started doing is degendering black people based on standards of especially white womanhood. And so black women are being degendered and seen and cast as masculine and not really women by comparing them to the standards that are set for the proper white woman who is, you know, very thin, not very strong, not very muscular. A standard that is, by the way, has nothing to do with like actual body types and more the fact that like women are very actively discouraged from lifting weights and like building big muscles. Like it's actually like a huge thing, which is weird. Just people are weak because like, let's face it, women with big muscles is fucking hot. But like just go talk to lesbians and everything is like. So I've said a lot of things. What do we do with all that information? What do we do with the knowledge that actually all of these attacks on trans people are tied to these reproductive ideals that drive the anti-abortion movement, and all of these things together are actually just instantiations of white supremacy? Well, the first thing it shows is the importance of solidarity. Trans people in many ways are canaries in a coal mine. The arguments that are being tried on trans people are the ones that they're going to be using against other groups, especially in targeting reproductive rights, but not only. Like, they use all the same arguments. This is especially important because, let's be real, abortion is not politically safe in Canada. And as much as I'd love to think that people will just care about trans people on their own right because trans people are people and matter, well, look, I know life. I know how things are. And I know like a lot of people just like kind of care about trans people and not enough to just do stuff. Because also, again, capitalism has made life really fucking hard for everybody. And so it's kind of hard to motivate yourself to even like get out of bed sometimes, let alone actually do shit. And so part of my pitch is when you're working for trans rights, you're actually serving other interests as well. You're actually fighting against racial supremacy and against sexism at the same time. Not always like you can in fact fight for trans rights and throw other people under the bus at the same time. But when you do that, it usually comes back and bite you in the ass because it means you didn't realize the way in which all of those structures are embedded together. And so, which brings us to my next point, which is my last point that I'll make before the Q&A. Understanding how oppression works makes us better at fighting it. So it's not just a matter of like trying to convince you all to care more about trans people. It's also like trying to help you understand how not only to fight transphobia better, but also how to address the forms of oppression that you and loved ones experience better. Whatever you're doing in terms of activism and fighting against oppression, it's connected. It's all connected. You know, like the meme with the guy with the red string? That. It's all connected, except it's like it actually is, right? Because for all the conspiracy theories that are out there, the biggest conspiracy, not conspiracy theory because it's real, is capitalism and connects to everything and ties everything together in a bow, and that one is actually excrement. Unlike the imaginary excrements of the UCP. I know I said I wouldn't take up all my time, but I still did anyway. And so I'll be just really happy to take any and all questions that you have.
Thank you very much. Since we're talking about trans and gender in a fascist context, that we're living in very turbulent times, put that together, then are there any existing safeguards? And the other thing is this is the use of language that I'm also concerned with. We also have such a thing as climate change, et cetera, et cetera. So being safe and being guarded, okay. I'd like you to comment on that in the context of your talk here today and whether, to what extent, if any, it works.
There's a lot of safeguards, not a lot of effective safeguards. That's always the problem. Part of the entire system is to put a lot of safeguards and then make sure that they don't work. Like, it's really hard. Actually, so in the second book that was mentioned in Gender Fucking, which is, by the way, just like mostly erotica, but I use the erotica to trick you all into reading theory. One of the last bits is about like hopelessness and the fact that like it really, in theory, I have so much hope for a better future, except that like there's this ticking clock of climate change that kind of like that we're pressing against, and I'm not sure that we're going to be able to like fix shit in time. You know, are there safeguards? Are there safeguards that are going to be effective enough to get us to where we need to be in time? I'm not sure, but in many ways, I think that safeguards are not necessarily what matters. What matters is power. Power in the hands of people. people's ability to offer alternatives when the system fails us, because it's going to fail us. And the safeguards, you can guarantee that like all of the like preppy white law professors are going to do, their job that they're paid for and try to figure out how to work those safeguards and try to figure out a way of getting around the notwithstanding clause all the way that we can. And like, we're doing that. But is it going to work? I don't know. But what's more important is that we don't expect it to work, and that we don't put any of your eggs in that basket. Like, it's not a question of like putting all your, like this room, don't put any of your eggs in that basket. Other people will put their eggs in that basket and are going to, ensure that that's covered. What's more important is making life livable in the here and now, so that we can build towards a better future by offering alternatives. So, all works there is like mutual aid and actually like rebuilding communities. Because one of the big things that's a big issue right now is people feel so disconnected, right? And there's many reasons for that. One of them is the internet. I say this as like somebody who like loves the internet. I love the internet so much. Like I was like a video game addict for so much of my life. I mean, once an addict, right? Like still am. Like I still cannot let myself like go to certain games, and I know that like it sounds kind of funny until you're no longer able to like kind of do anything else with your life. Part of what has disconnected us is, for all I love, a lot of us have lost local community. Third spaces, you can just like go and drop in and just like chill with people and not have to buy anything, and just know your community, know the people who are like living next door and all of that. Like, we've lost a lot of that. We need to rebuild that. We need to get people involved in like the lower levels of politics. It's about, building community and getting to know who our neighbors are, and like showing up to like the boring ass town halls. Sometimes I'll just like, I'll bake bread and I'll give it to my, like the guy who makes my coffee because he's so nice. It doesn't seem like we're doing activism a lot of the time when we're doing that, but like it is. I mean, there's various groups I always like kind of look back to in terms of organizing inspirations, and one that's coming to mind right now is the Black Panthers. They would run programs to give food to kids, but then you get to know people, you get to know families. They start getting involved with the movement, they start to know you, and that becomes a sort of like the entryism, right? The far right has a lot of entryism, right? The sort of like you start, looking at YouTube at skincare, and 2 months later, you're like fucking doing Sieghaus and shit. And I'm not only talking about Elon Musk. But like, we need to build our own networks like that, right? The ones that are like good networks, the one that give people like, who feel like, help people feel like their life is meaningful and they know people and people care and will smile at them when they enter a room. Be like, by the way, do you want to make your community better? Do you want to do things to make things better? Do you want, we need to provide these very real alternatives. It's hard work, sometimes uncomfortable, because sometimes in any community there's going to be assholes that you cannot stand. Sometimes they're not assholes, sometimes they're actually like nice, but you just don't jive with them at all. In my days of like college age activism, you do notice that like every organization implodes every about 3 years. It's about how long it can last without some rift blowing shit up. And like, we need to start to learn how to like talk to people again. And we need to do that, across generations, because one of the big problem is like people are not learning from other generations. They don't talk to their elders, they don't talk to people who have like actually done the work before, have figured out this shit, because it takes a lifetime to figure out how to handle being human, sometimes more. But if we don't talk to people who are further along in that process, then we don't get to actually benefit from what they've learned. And then we have to start from scratch, and when we start from scratch, we're actually all bad at it. And it's like the first time you drive. I don't know, I was always bad at driving, no matter how long I did it. Okay, so that's my answer.
There was a special episode on TV that talked about rural Alberta and the libraries that are being shut down. The reason is always budget cuts, but the commonality that the show pointed out is that every single one of these libraries supports transgender children in support groups, books, things like that. And it was suggesting that they were actually utilizing the trans kid as a scapegoat to distract the public from a different secret agenda that they were attacking or doing. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Scapegoating is always two things at once. Like, they're always targeting people because they want to target people because the targeting itself does something. But if it can also distract from something else, that's also great at the same time. And so I think, there's always going to be kind of multiple things at once. And at the broad scale, I think it's true that, like, the UCP is kind of drumming up a lot of stuff around trans kids and these, like, kind of far-right cultural war issues in order to distract the fact that they're like, they just suck so much as a government and are, like, from all I can tell, extremely corrupt. They're distracting from that. They're trying to distract you. This room a lot less than, like, the base of the UCP. But one thing that always strikes me with things like, libraries in rural areas and stuff like that is just how much, like, the government that claims to be for rural areas, for rural Albertans, are actually, like, the worst ones for them. And part of the reason for that is because as much as they complain about socialism and this sort of, like, distribution of resources to ensure that everybody has at least, like, basic needs met, as much as it fails, like, a lot of these programs are actually, like, highly beneficial to rural areas because, let's face it, getting the money to build a hospital in a rural area based solely on, like, the free market is like, that's gonna take a hot minute. Libraries in rural areas, healthcare services, all of these things are what the UCP is decrying as socialist policies. And when they're privatizing everything, they're essentially attacking rural areas. And here we get to kind of the scapegoat aspect where, ironically, while they claim budget cuts, if everybody thinks it's about trans kids rather than they get to have their cake and eat it too? Or eat their cake and have it too, probably more. They get to get people who vote for them thinking, oh, well, it was just about trans kids. It wasn't actually about taking away all the stuff that makes rural areas, like, better to live in. On the flip side, they get to say it's just finances, so they don't get sued out the wazoo for closing stuff, by reason of trans people. And so you do have kind of the distraction that's kind of built into moves like these. But it's a broader pattern of neoliberal governance where they're just trying to take away any sort of public service from everybody. And let's be real, the place where it tends to be the most expensive is in rural areas because people are really, really far apart. And so you need to have, the sort of, like, services per area. You need to have a lot more in order for people not to have to drive 5 hours to go to the hospital. Whereas in the city, you're never 5 hours away from the hospital, and there's a bunch of hospitals. And so, it's a lot easier for them to justify these costs. Like, I think it's true that there's scapegoating going on and distraction going on, and I think also that the attack is also the point at the same time. The reality is, like, in a lot of kind of right-wing politics, a lot of things have, like, a lot of function at the same time, and it's a bit of a throw everything at the wall and see what sticks strategy that surprisingly works very well because people, like, minority groups, don't have the resources to really challenge these things. And that's also true of, like, people living in rural areas, because it's a lot harder to organize to fight against the governments doing these things. And so the strategy, unfortunately, works quite well. I'm so depressing. It's great.
Down in the States, there's been a number of high-profile political engagements in which Republicans would address certain people using dead naming them. Right now, there's a rally at the legislature to let the UCP know feelings about trans situations. There may or may not be a sign there that says Marlena. And I'm curious, specifically here in Edmonton on social media now, there's a discussion going on about dead naming using Marlena. Do you have any opinion on that?
I think I file this in the category of, like, yes, it's technically, like, if I'm applying all of my politics and analysis to calling her Marlena, like, I do kind of agree that, like, we shouldn't do that, but also it's really low on my list of priorities. I don't care enough to actually wade into that debate, because like treating names and identities as like conditional, even if it's just to show the hypocrisy of people, is not great. But at the same time, we have a lot more to do than like spending those endless debates. I think a lot of why these debates happen, especially online, is because it's just one of the few contexts in which a lot of people get to actually feel like their voice matters, and where they get to feel like people care. Like if you're trans and debating, other progressives online, getting into debate, like correcting them and saying like don't talk like that and stuff like that. A lot of the time, it's not necessarily about like the issue in and of itself, and is more about the very ability to correct somebody and them actually like care about what you say and potentially being like, oh yeah, like I hadn't thought about this. Let me fix that and something like that, right? So like there's a sense where like trans people are feeling incredibly disempowered, especially young trans people, while these debates are largely like ineffective. And I think like frankly people know that. When you get home after thinking all day about like just how much everything sucks, getting to like just yell at somebody a little bit on the internet and them being like potentially, I guess you're right, just kind of feels good. Sometimes you just need to yell at somebody, right? And I think that's true for like a lot of these debates that seem very pointless that happen in the left, and what gets pejoratively called political correctness is like, a lot of these debates happen because, like, technically, the people are right, and yes, they are a low priority. But also, having these debates is like one of the few ways in which you get to one, vent a little bit, like yell at somebody, and also feel like you have a modicum of social power instead of everybody not giving a shit about you. And so, like, I think that's also something to kind of have in mind. Is like a lot of the time, the debate is not what the debate is about. It's somebody doing the debate because doing the debate serves a desire or a need, regardless of the actual substance and what the debate is about. So that's generally my thought on that.
I'm sure as somebody who works in health ethics, you've been following the Compassionate Intervention Act. And so I'm just wondering how you see the involuntary or forced treatment of people who use drugs impacting other marginalized groups, and what that might look like for all of us.
There's 3 parts to my thoughts on that. The first part is, I actually haven't like dug into the law that much, so I haven't like seen the cogs in the machine and exactly how all of the things work. So I only know like the broad lines. But somebody that I love and trust a lot and is actually an expert on this shit says that it fucking sucks. And so that's my general stance, because I'm not an expert, but she's an expert, and she says that it sucks, therefore it sucks. But there's the law professor answer, and then there's the sort of like sciencey person answer. The first one is the law professor answer, which is no. Constitutional rights are there for a reason, and things like forced treatment is something that we must like. The social cost of allowing any of that is just too high, regardless of the actual potential benefits of the policy, which, I mean, is going to be the second part of my answer. But like, even if we assume that there are like benefits to the policy, the costs in just weakening the rights that are implicated here are too high, right? The first rule of the Nuremberg Code, which was passed after the Nuremberg trial because of all of the Nazi doctors doing research on people and torturing people and being like really fucking awful. The very first one is informed consent for any and all research, but also it extends to kind of treatment more generally. And there's been a weakening in research ethics, especially the requirement of consent to treatment, and something we really need to be like going back on. Like this is really bad. It's really dangerous, and we're starting to see a lot of like the pitfalls of weakening the requirement of consent. So the first thing is absolutely the fuck not. So that's the sort of like legal / high-level bioethics question. Then there's the like sciencey answer, which is it doesn't fucking work. Like, the thing is, forcing people to do stuff very, very rarely works out well. Because when you force people into treatment, then they're just angry at you, and want to spite you. And so I have two words tattooed here, and the second one is davka, which is doing things out of spite. So the two words are lishma and davka. Lishma is like doing things for their own sake, and davka is doing things out of spite. This is my two modes. Those are the two reasons I ever do anything. At the very least, the second one is something that's true for a lot of people. In fact, raise your hand if you like doing stuff out of spite. Right? It's fun. Like, oh, I can't do this? Fucking watch me. And so, that's what's going to be happening. Like, yes, there's going to be a few cases where it's going to work for a particular person, but at the overall level, it actually might end up being worse, because when you're being forced to do something rather than doing it on your own free choice, then you're not really, the will is not there, right? And that's actually a big problem with, so one of the things I teach is criminal law. And when we talk about prisons, that's one of the big problem with the assumption that this is a rehabilitative project, which have you learned any history? But besides the history element, the problem with the rehabilitative kind of assumption behind prison is that you can't force people into rehabilitating, because rehabilitation is the kind of stuff that you need people to want. And your goal should not be to force people into doing the thing you want them to do, but rather to make them want it. That's oftentimes, when it comes to anything public health related, that's usually the best approach, is getting people to want the thing and making it as accessible as possible once they do want it. And that usually actually leads to a lot more people going through those programs than being forced into it. But the government doesn't care. The government just wants to say, we did it, we sent people into a program, this number of people were treated, and then if they, say, relapse again, then they'll say, well, it's their fault. It's because they were weak-willed. It's because we give them all the tools.
You made me recall something, and I have a question after this disclosure. I remember early 2000s, a biologist from the United States, a researcher, Anne Fausto Sterling, I think, wrote a fantastic piece that is called 5 Sexes. Essentially, it's a very complex text, a fantastic one. Essentially, I learned in that text that we are all trans. Really. Within the continuum, we all have varieties of both sexes. And from that perspective, in that context, I learned the struggle for trans rights is a struggle for the very recognition of our humanity. We are all have to defend trans rights because we all have a little bit of transsexuality in us. So do you think it makes sense to use scientific evidence within our debates to convince the public that it makes sense to defend trans rights and so on and so forth?
I'm familiar with the sort of we're all trans argument based on this idea of kind of the spectrum of sex. And so while technically I disagree, we're not all trans, but the reason is that gender and sex are already social constructs, and so we can't actually appeal to the body in defining them. We have to appeal to society's relationship to the body, and so in that sense, to the extent that certain bodies are deemed by society not to be intersex, then people are not going to be deemed by society to be trans, right? And so to me, that's where kind of the thing spins. But where I think you're absolutely right is in the recognition of human diversity and the diversity of both the body and gender. Everybody has a different relationship to gender, and also everybody's bodies are different in various ways. And the standards of gender that we impose upon people, be they in terms of social stuff or in terms of bodies and things like that, will never actually satisfy anybody. They always suck for somebody, because nobody is ever cis enough, nobody is ever straight enough. That's not a thing, because it's supposed to be an unattainable standard, because how gender ideology, and I don't mean what they call trans people, but I mean the actual the system of gender and ideology that operates within society is predicated on mutual enforcement, is predicated on people policing each other. And how do you get people to police each other? By making them insecure. And so there is a reality, and I see it a lot in my next book, which based on my doctorate, I looked a lot about court cases about parents of trans kids. And one thing that recurs is dads being insecure about their own gender and their kids' transition sparking that. And it's not that any of them are like trans or want to transition or anything like that, but it's just that like none of them are actually masculine enough for the standards of society tells them they should meet. Their kid confronts them to that reality, and that challenges them. And so in that sense, transliberation does also mean liberating everybody from those insecurities, right? Once we attain transliberation, if we ever do, hopefully, it will also mean like liberating people from the gender police in their head. And, you know, if ACAB, also gender police. And then the last tiny word I wanted to say was regarding, you know, families of people who, forcing people into treatment is better than people being dead, and like that's true. There's a twofold fear. One is that while that is going to be true for some people, there's also going to be the inverse that's going to be the case for some other people, and so we have to think about that too, the people who are going to be forced into treatment and end up so traumatized from it that then they're going to die. And then the other one is, we tend to think of like either this law or nothing, and what about like doing stuff, just not this stuff, right? So like, what else can we do that's gonna avoid the pitfalls of this approach while not just falling back on this like shitty neoliberal status quo where nobody gets any services and you have to like raw dog life, which like nobody wants to do that. So that was my thoughts on this, and I think we're out of time.
Yes, we are out of time. Thank you, Florence, so much.